Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Tiffany Liu, and with me as always are Kensho Watanabe and William White. This week, we'll be discussing the recent AI completion of Beethoven's 10th Symphony. Then we'll discuss the 2021 OPERALIA competition. Finally, we'll discuss perceptions and misperceptions of elitism in classical music. But first, we'd like to start with our prelude segment, and we're joined today by our unofficial official intern, Joey. So, Joey, what do we have today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Name That Tune, aka Stump the Hosts.
And now, Free Zone presents Name That Tune.
Music games don't come any simpler and any more intimidating than Name That Tune. And this game is especially fraught for our hosts, since none of them know what they're about to hear. That's because these Name That Tune submissions come from you, our loyal listeners. Your hosts make no guarantee that they'll be able to identify precisely what these pieces are, but we hope that hearing their thought processes will elucidate something about how they listen to music and provide some entertaining musical banter. So that none of them can see the submissions, I'm once again here to officiate unofficially. Today's first Name That Tune submission comes from listener Satish. Here it is.
Here we go again.
All right, well, we've got some huge cinematic or symphonic soundscape here. Big orchestra, big percussion, brass, strings, everybody blazing. I think that consistent with listener Satish's previous submissions, of which there have been many, I think that we find ourselves once again in the Anglo-American 20th century, potentially film score, but not necessarily film score realm. Are you with me that far?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, now we're just kind of playing against the matchup of all of Satish's previous submissions. But this had a little bit more of like a Russian aftertaste, perhaps, in the music. So I'm not saying that the composer is Russian, but maybe that will inform in some way.
Tiff, you sounded like you agreed with that.
I do. I mean, at the end there, I was sort of, there's a little Tchaikovsky in there, you know?
Mm.
You know who came to mind? Who was the composer who, the last time Richard Bratby was on this show, that we brought him on to discuss?
Oh, Malcolm Arnold?
Malcolm Arnold.
It could be Malcolm Arnold.
Yeah, this is like a little too traditional maybe, but I'm putting him on my list. Yeah, I mean, and in terms of like the Tchaikovsky thing, I mean, to me it would be like Tchaikovsky via Sibelius, you know, like right at the end there with some of those little arabesque influence melodies. I don't know. And those big dominant seventh chords, you know, just laying it out there. I mean, maybe Khachaturian could be a Soviet composer I could get on board with.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know, something about all the percussion makes me feel like you were right with your Anglo-American. Like, we've got to have an American in there, right? We've got to have a film composer in there, maybe.
Yeah, that snare in there. I mean, that made me lean British, actually, but my first inclination was definitely American. This is more American than Miklos Rozsa, I think. But Rozsa would be one to maybe include. Well, I don't want to take all day with this. I mean, I would say if you guys don't have any other ideas, my basket is Malcolm Arnold, Aram Khachaturian, and Miklos Rozsa. Anybody want to blackball any of those or suggest something else?
This is a hole in my repertoire. I actually don't know any film composers other than, you know, like the blockbusters that we discuss already.
John Williams, yeah. All right, Joey. That's gonna be our trio right there.
All right, none of those were correct. This is Charles Villiers Stanford's Irish Rhapsody number 4, opus 141, The Fisherman of Loch Ness.
Satish, wow, what an evil little troll. Beating us at our own game when we did a whole segment about the Villiers Stanford Irish Rhapsodies.
And Satish actually left a little side note in
She
submission.
did. Interesting. How nice of Satish to leave a little side note. What did his side note say?
Thank you very much.
You want to hear it?
Yeah.
I don't.
He writes, Stanford was a prolific English, maybe Irish, composer of sacred choral music, but also had a huge output in terms of orchestral works, 7 symphonies, 6 Irish rhapsodies, as well as chamber music works, 8 string quartets, etc.
Yeah, well, if listener Satish had heard our St. Patrick's Day episode from earlier this year, he would know that we know that, except for the fact that apparently we don't know that because we didn't recognize this piece. All right, let's do the next one here, Joey.
Our next submission comes from listener Ian. Here it is.
Mid-romantic, maybe late romantic violin concerto in the virtuosic era, which for me, like, something about that writing is not especially idiomatic, right? It's not in the style of like the real virtuosic violin, like let's say I'm talking about Wieniawski, I'm talking about who else am I talking about? Kensho.
Paganini.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Vuitton?
Yes,
Vuitton,
that was the one I was looking for. So it's not quite fluent enough, which, like, if I'm looking at the layer underneath that, De Barrio and Saint-Saëns, actually, I'll throw Saint-Saëns in there. I think that's not a, because he did, I mean, if that's Violin Concerto number 3, I actually have no idea what the first 2 sound like. So
I think that I don't know, for some reason, like Weinberg came up, Weinberg Violin Concerto. Yeah, in terms of like off the beaten path violin concertos that are kind of in that time. I'm not sure.
Okay, hey, I've got nothing to add to this. I think that's a good De Barrio, Saint-Saëns, and Weinberg.
Viotti or Vizzotti.
Oh, Viotti. Yeah.
It's a little earlier, but I think
it's too weird for that, though, don't you think?
It was strange. This was very like scattershot, like not continuous. I mean, I don't know what that means, but that was my.
Okay, let's go with that basket that Will said.
Close as always, but no cigar. This is Hans Pfitzner's Violin Concerto in B minor, opus 37.
What year is this from?
The year is 1923 for this piece.
That's much later than I would have guessed.
Yeah, I could have gone a century earlier than that, but that's also probably why I don't know this name.
And I think of Pfitzner as being a much more like Straussian composer. But this wasn't a particularly early work of his, I guess. Opus 37, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well played, listener Ian. Very nice. All right, what's our last one here, Joey?
Today's last one comes from listener Eric. Here it is.
Kind of a wind-centric excerpt where the strings are kind of doing the accompaniment figures. To me, it sounded like kind of Carnival of the Animals, like or maybe it's like it almost sounded like a variation of a theme, let's say, in terms of like the way it was orchestrated, and also just the fact that the theme kept coming back and stuff like this. I was like, maybe this is like a variation of a theme.
I got slight ballet vibes from this. That occurred to either of you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Funny that you said Saint-Saëns. I also thought that this might be French. Maybe it was the woodwind solos that gave that away. Maybe it was something about the running harmonies and the strings below. I don't know. I put this like somewhere between Franck and Sibelius, who's not French, but I would still put that as sort of like an upper bound. Like there were elements of Sibelius in this that I heard.
Right.
Saint-Saëns is not a bad choice in that regard.
No.
Delibes, was actually the first name that I wrote down.
I like that.
Tiff, what do you think of this?
I don't know, something about was there a triangle in there? Or did my mind just
Yeah, there was a
No,
triangle.
there was.
Yeah,
There's a triangle and like this kind of running stuff that's going on in the cellos and the violas. Like something about that whole texture made me think possibly Russian. I don't know who I would go with for that.
I mean, I wrote Stravinsky at one point. I mean, I don't think this was, but
I
like,
mean, it had to go in a different realms harmonically for that to be the case. But like this does kind of call to mind like the fairy divertimento,
the fairy's kiss.
Yeah.
What about like Glinka? Could that be? Or Gounod even? I mean, not Russian, but back to the French.
Too interesting for Gounod.
How dare you? Yeah, I would put Glinka on the list. I think that's
sure,
a good
why
name
not?
to include. You want to say Glinka, Saint-Saëns?
You had Delibes. I think that's not bad.
Okay, and Delibes. Let's make that our list. Joey, you haven't given us a hint yet.
I was just going to say, I'm going to jump in with the unofficial official hint of the month.
He always waits for us to completely swing and miss first, and then he like catches our swing and is like, no, try again.
Yeah, exactly.
This week, it's not at all a swing and a miss. You all are very, very close with the French line of thought, specifically the time period of composers you are discussing, as well as a composer of ballets and operas and that kind of music.
But we haven't said the name.
But you have not said the name, even in discussion yet.
Massenet is another name that we have not said.
Could we go later? I mean, was there like, there's kind of like, there's a traditionalist bent that Saint-Saëns represents in contrast with like some of the Les Six, for example, like later on.
So does that mean we should go earlier?
I think it means we might go later, actually, because I think that like some of the, like the grand ballet stuff.
Who else is writing those French ballets? Adolphe Adam?
Sure. Sounds good to me.
There's Dubois. I keep circling back. Massenet is as good as I can possibly get on this. Massenet, Adolphe Adam, and Théodore Dubois. That's our new list.
Massenet is the one.
Yes.
This is his symphonic poem entitled Vision.
Pretty.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joseph.
You're very welcome. That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we move on, we'd like to remind our listeners that these listener-generated Name That Tune rounds are a regular feature of our show. So as ever, we invite you to try and stump our hosts. Check the show notes where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second unidentified clip of classical music for them to try to identify.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph. A pleasure as always to have you here. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Kensho, what do you have for us?
We classical musicians seem to be fascinated by unfinished works by well-known composers. Whether it's the myriad completions of Gustav Mahler's 10th Symphony or just Franz Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, some of us cannot resist imagining and extrapolating what could have been had these composers lived just a bit longer. To add a unique approach to such a completionist challenge, a group of musicologists teamed up with experts in artificial intelligence in an attempt to complete Ludwig van Beethoven's 10th Symphony from the very little that the composer left in sketches before his death in 1827. Let's hear a clip. This AI-generated work was premiered on October 9th with the Beethoven Orchestra Bonn, conducted by Dirk Kaftan. A few weeks ago, we covered AI's imitation of Philip Glass's music, and now here we are with AI completing a work that is ascribed to the great Beethoven. So what are our thoughts here?
To say that this is a completion of Beethoven's 10th Symphony would imply that Beethoven had started writing his 10th Symphony. And there's just no material sense in which that's really the case. I mean, he was making sketches, sure. I mean, they said that, they had something like 40 sketches. But for Beethoven, I mean, for a symphony, 40 sketches is nothing. I mean, Beethoven was constantly sketching. And the thing about the way that Beethoven sketched was he was very fecund with his ideas, and he kept a notepad with him everywhere that he went, and he sketched down ideas for, it could be anything, a texture, a melody, a harmonic progression, whatever. And the really important thing to know about what Beethoven did with his sketches is that he reassembled them. It was like a gin player who shuffles their deck and then goes out at the very last second. At any point, he could have repurposed one of these sketches for a piano trio or a string quartet or, I don't know, a song cycle. I mean, like anything. So to say that these 40 sketches necessarily, the content of them would have even ended up in a 10th symphony is already a stretch. As to the content of what, I mean, like I did not like listening to this. I did not like it. It sounded too much like his fifth. It was like the fifth turned upside down. That was it. It was the motive of the fifth turned upside down. It's like, what are we doing?
As with a lot of AI projects, like these generative things, you're going to read the comments and hear some of what Will expressed, but also some of like, well, AI cannot imitate the heartache that Beethoven went through, and the AI cannot, there's something inexplicable and kind of I don't mean superhuman as an extra human, but I mean very human, right, about what Beethoven wrote that is presumably missing from this piece of AI-generated work. To that objection, I'm going to say, this sounds like Beethoven. It does not sound like Beethoven. This has incorporated all of the language that they have been feeding it. And the answer to the question of why do a project like this seems to mostly lie in because we can, or like to see if we can more accurately, which I think is like, that's where you have to start thinking with these AI projects. What are the limits of this? Can we find those limits of our computer technology and coding prowess? And have we found those yet? And if the brief is to generate something that sounds like Beethoven, yeah, I think check, let's find the next one. Where it fails for me is it's a marketing overreach, as Will suggested. Like, why do we do this? Well, it's the same reason the reason to bill it as Beethoven's 10th is the same reason that we have to say, well, we want a 108 key piano, or that we have to have like uncover the latest Stradivarius secret of like what makes these violins. It's all just trying to ride the already well-known pop image of Beethoven into the sunset. If it comes down to it and like hold any of these guys to the fire, they're not going to be like, no, this is definitely for Beethoven's 10th. Like they're not that idiotic, but that's the catchiest way to build a project. And so fine, I guess. And where it falls down for me is like, this is not what Beethoven's 10th would have sounded like. We know this. Beethoven's 9th is way wilder than this. And, we've heard late Beethoven, really late Beethoven string quartets, and they're nothing like what his heroic period embodied, which is essentially what I think this project is going after, and probably where most of the copyable patterns that they fed the AI came from.
Speaking to that marketability of a project like this, which I already feel dirty even saying that, over under of within a season or not, will another orchestra program this AI generated Beethoven 10th for a performance on this season?
I doubt it, but within the next decade, definitely a few will. It's a little bit different than, say, something like Stravinsky's Funeral Song, which was a rediscovered early work. And when they did discover that got programmed all over the place. For this, I mean, I don't know. I think that they'll wait for another Beethoven anniversary year. There always seems to be one around the corner. But I wanted to respond to a couple of things that Tiffany said. One is just to say that, like, if you read the article about this, and which we will, of course, link in the show notes, this is like an AI plus people project. You know, I mean, to say that this is like a pure, and I'm not saying that that's what Tiffany was saying, but I just want to remark on the fact that, like, a lot of human hands were involved in this. And it wasn't necessarily clear just how that division of labor worked, but this is not just like a purely computer-generated thing. Like, they clearly had to manipulate what was going on.
I found it very interesting how much they emphasized, like, the fact that they added this human aspect to this process, as if, like, that lended more legitimacy to this project. Like, oh no, like, humans saw it too, so it's more believable that this is really the 10th symphony. I don't know, it was just odd.
I think that reads as a pretty clearly reactionary comment in order to, you know, respond to all the naysayers of, like, a computer can never have as much soul as a human and compose music that is as touching and so on.
Right. And then the other thing is that we know as conductors, like, there is definitely a thing in our field of too many cooks in the kitchen. Like, I mean, I would love to know what that creative process was like, to be like, okay, this is what the AI spit out. Okay, how do we edit this to make it more real? And you've got, you know, people that have very strong opinions, like Robert Levin, involved in this. So, like, how does that all, you know, shake out?
And then the other thing I wanted to mention was, okay, so then Tiffany, like, you were saying, you know, part of the reason to do this is just to see if we can. And I agree with that. It's like a moonshot thing, right? And, like, you know, we find our way to landing on the moon, and because of that, we have innovated in all of this, like, computer technology and GPS and yada yada yada.
I don't even think it goes that far for a lot of these people. It's not even like we're seeing if we can so that we can do X, Y, and Z. It's like, we're seeing if we can.
But that's what I'm saying is, like, I think the moonshot, like, the corollary advances that were made that turned out to be, you know, obviously much more important to our daily lives than just, like, sending a couple guys to the moon. But to what end is this? You know, like, what is this going to get us?
Well, standing from this side, you don't know. That's the point, right?
Yeah.
They don't ask these questions of them. Like, I mean, let's go with a tragic example of the A-bomb. In the stereotype of all the stories of the teams who work on it, there were the people who were just trying to see if they could.
Right.
Full stop. No justification, including no thought about the ramifications, the negative ramifications of their invention. They were just trying to touch the depths of that scientific field, you know, and if there were people who existed to fund that effort, great, awesome. And is it any of their business if their invention gets used for good or evil? No, not really. That's the stereotype. I mean, that's the one that, you know, gets fictionalized and kind of drawn up in stories a lot, right? And I standing from this side of the innovation, there is no way for you to know what may or may not come from an AI ability to recognize a full set of sonic patterns and spit out something that sounds more or less like them. But if you abstractify it to that way, I bet you could even think of a few examples right now that might pan out, you know, maybe not like music theory examples or like great compositional examples, but so what?
Yeah, it's hard for me to see what the purpose of making these particular advances are, but I could definitely see what the purpose of redirecting some of the money that went into this AI would be if you gave it to actual living composers who are writing music and trying to, you know, pay their rent and stuff like that.
And also, there's just other kinds of even classical music that might lend itself better to AI. Like, even the minimalist stuff from Philip Glass, I kind of get. And, like, but, like, where's a 12-tone matrix generated pieces?
Wow, what a good point. Yes.
Like, that actually would be applicable, you know?
Right.
And geez, and the only thing I think about when I think about this AI stuff is, boy, like, if I knew how to code this stuff really well, I would have done so much better in my music theory classes where they asked me to compose in the style of, you know, like, remember we had to do like write a Bach convention or write a Mozart string quartet, you know, like all in these little styles. And, like, if you just get predictive, iterative code that can just do that for us, I mean, this is what kids will be doing, I guess.
So now you've answered the question. This is just to make money off of music theory students.
College
music
They're
theory
so
students.
that's such a
Yes.
lucrative market.
That's the lucrative market. There you have it. Yep.
All right, listeners. Well, you clearly know how we feel about this, but we would love to hear from you to see what you think. So click the link and check out is there a performance that we've linked now? Or
Yeah,
no?
there's a full album on Spotify.
Great. So check out the album. Best of luck in getting through all of it. But let us know what you think. On to our second topic, Tiffany.
Well, for our second topic today, OPERALIA is an annual opera singing competition that was founded in 1993 by Placido Domingo to, quote, discover and help launch the careers of the most promising young opera singers of today. OPERALIA's stated goal is to attract singers between the ages of 18 and 32 of all voice types from all over the world. And then, of course, they audition and are heard by a panel of distinguished international personalities in what is supposed to be one of the most prestigious and competitive showcases in the world. This year, the finals for this competition took place at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, and winners were announced on October 24th. If you missed it, you'll be delighted to know that you can watch the entire final concert on YouTube. Because the competition was canceled last year, more prizes were awarded in most categories than usual, so there's plenty to gab about this year. Any favorites, guys, or lowlights?
Someone that really stood out to me was the countertenor. His name is Cayman Mura.
Yeah.
He only sang once. There were some people that sang twice because they were up for the Zarzuela, which we should talk about because that's also very interesting. But he was definitely a performance that I really enjoyed. But my main thing was just, I don't know, due to the pandemic or whatever, what the rehearsal structure was for this. But I mean, it was just so distracting. I've never, how do I say this nicely? I just found it surprising how ratchet the orchestra sounded.
Yeah. Well, the low light for me was definitely Domingo's conducting and handling of that orchestra, I have to say.
Yeah, that's what we have to. I mean, we should mention that Placido Domingo himself conducts the final round, the orchestra. He has fashioned himself into an ersatz conductor over the past 20 years, and he has never risen from the ersatz level of conducting. The orchestra was quite messy. I felt bad for some of these singers that they didn't have more professional level of support in the pit because there were some astonishing performances from the singers. You know, you can say a lot of things about Placido Domingo, and I'm sure that we're going to say some of them, but, you know, he might have been a great singer, but a great conductor he ain't.
If you're watching a concert and you see the conductor, like, if the conductor's like flipping a number of pages, it's probably because they had some of it memorized and weren't, keeping up, right? But if you see a conductor flip forward and then
Back.
flip back and then look very confused, that person's lost.
Well, while we're trashing Placido Domingo, I mean, I think that we should just mention that, like, this is a guy who's been credibly accused of sexual harassment. He retired from the LA Opera for this reason, and they did an investigation where they found that the accusations that had been made against him by a number of women over many decades were credible. So, okay, fine, he wasn't found guilty in a court of law, but I mean, like, their internal investigation found that this was credible. And I don't know, I mean, it does tinge my viewing experience of this because you just feel like, okay, he invented this program for young singers, in 1993. I mean, this is decades ago now. Like, I'm not lobbing any specific accusation against him, but like, you've got to wonder, I mean, here he has having access to young singers in their 20s in their formative stage. He's offering them this experience to further their career. They owe everything to him. I mean, it kind of squigs me out. So I think that that's just worth mentioning.
Like Tiffany said in the intro, it's really well regarded even to this day. It's got Rolex as one of the sponsors of this. I think like it's surprising that he has still managed to hold on to this and not only be associated with the competition, but be conducting the finals of this. Like he's taking a central role in this.
But this is his organization.
Right.
It's not that surprising really at all. And especially given that in Europe, they generally think we're in hysterics over all this, all this social media, all justice stuff.
Well, yeah, I think that if you get canceled in America, you go to Europe, and if you get canceled in Europe, you go to Russia, and then if you get canceled in Russia, you come to the United States. But anyway, we should. I mean, we don't have to just sit here and shit on Placido Domingo the whole time. But even though it's fun, we should talk about some of the singers.
Yeah. So I mentioned. I really enjoyed Keeman.
He has a very unique voice, right? He's singing like a real. It's like mezzo aria, and it's not like some Baroque, countertenor thing, which is always very acrobatic and fun and impressive. But like this is wild.
Oh, he's hitting high Bs.
Yeah.
Multiple high Bs.
Yeah. I was blown away by both of the first prize winners, especially the mezzo who won first prize, Victoria Karkacheva. First of all, I'm happy that it wasn't a soprano. Actually, we've alluded to in the past how the soprano is the more glamorous role. Like that's who we're gonna get. Boy, this instrument is unbelievable, and the soul and the kind of depth in the voice I thought was really spectacular, and precisely the way that I think you're talking about, Kensho. And I think it's also worth mentioning that she is like very much on the upper bound of the age range here, 31. I don't know, guys. My takeaway from this, my absolute favorite, was this Jonah Hoskins, this American tenor, 24-year-old Mormon kid. I mean, singing La Fille du Régiment. Yeah, that was very famous exciting. Aria, À mes amis, quel jour de fête.
How many high Cs?
He actually adds more than there are supposed to be, and then he goes higher.
He adds. Yeah, right. So there's something like, 40 high Cs in this aria, no matter what. And then he adds, and then just to put the whipped cream on top, he trills that last C. He trills a C and a D. Oh my God, this guy has got it.
Yeah.
And I mean, talk about, and you can even hear, I think, that, it's like, Tiffany, that you're saying, it's like, especially with singers, like, the voice doesn't fully mature until a couple, until a good decade later. I mean, if this is where this kid is right now, holy moly. Keep an eye on Jonah Hoskins. That was my takeaway from this. So did you guys watch any of these zarzuela rounds? This is this optional thing because Placido Domingo, when he was growing up as a kid, his parents ran a zarzuela theater in Mexico City. And I guess we should define zarzuela, which is sort of like...
please, for my sake.
Well, it's like a Spanish operetta, basically. It's more of a populist genre, like the Brits have their Gilbert and Sullivan, like the Germans have their, operatic tradition, and in Vienna, you've got people like, Franz von Suppe or something. So this is like the Spanish version of that. And because of that, Placido Domingo has made it an optional choice for the singers that they can pick a zarzuela aria and participate in that part of the competition. Not everybody does it, but some people do. What did you guys make of the zarzuelas?
I didn't necessarily see the point. I would love to know more about that. Like, okay, so is this a chance for Placido to kind of continue that tradition or kind of propagate it through the competition by coaching these singers through zarzuela arias? Like, do they get coachings through that and they learn about this style? Or is it just kind of like, just throw a zarzuela up there and then, because, honestly, like orchestrally speaking, I mean, I didn't hear or discern anything different from the other arias.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the zarzuela stuff is in a more, it's in that kind of Italianate,
sure,
post-bel canto, almost Bizet, Carmen, it's got aspects of that. It's just supposed to be a little bit lighter. Not all of it is. And I think that the reason he does it is just to propel the art form a little bit. I don't know, maybe, I don't know if these people are going to go sing zarzuela roles in, Barcelona or something in like the municipal theater.
Right.
But, I watched it and my takeaway was like, okay, why are we doing this? Except the tenor who won first prize, this Peruvian guy named Ivan Ion Rivas, I thought that his zarzuela performance, which was not one of the showier arias, it was much more of like a pathos laden, kind of a slow piece. I thought that was fantastic.
I suspect that this may have something to do with the language, because like fluency in multiple different languages is a skill that singers cultivate in this field, and the more languages that you have a grasp of, the more valued you are in the field. But for whatever reason, a standard person is not going to think of a lot of Spanish language operas. Mm-hmm. So I suspect that may be part of the angle to keep this, like in the training. This is like, we expect fluency in multiple different languages, including Spanish, which is very unlikely to show up in these rounds otherwise. All right. Well, actually a really fun viewing experience. I don't know. For me, watching an opera is a little bit like watching a movie in that I have to gin myself up to do it. And this is a nice way of like just sucking up really, really unbelievable singing without the kind of emotional investment of like sinking myself in for a full opera. So it's a fun viewing experience. Check it out. It's on YouTube. Include the link in the show notes. And let's go on to our third topic for today. Will?
If there's an easy way to put classical music lovers on the defensive, it's to accuse them of elitism. And I think that's because we who are devoted to this art form are genuinely in it for the love of the music, not the social cachet, of which, truth be told, there remains very little, or any misguided sense of superiority because of our taste. In recent decades, many of our classical institutions have made real efforts to make the concert experience a more inviting and less intimidating one. And chief among these innovations are reduced ticket prices. In my personal experience, tickets for a major symphony orchestra or opera performance in the US can be had for under $50 apiece, often well under that amount. And if you're a student or part of a special group, you might get in for something like $10 or even for free. And that brings us to our guest today, Tommy Pearson, a former radio presenter on both Classic FM and the BBC, now a producer of symphonic film concerts. Pearson got a lot of attention this past week, and much of it negative, when he retweeted the price levels for Adele's upcoming London concert, which start at £90 or $122 and top out at £590 or $805. Pearson's commentary simply read, "Remember everyone, classical music is elitist, just for the rich, and excludes people who can't afford it." To discuss the topic of elitism, and perhaps more importantly, perceived elitism in classical music, we are very happy to have him with us. Tommy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
All right, Tommy, I want to get to the little firestorm and a lot of the responses that your tweet kicked up this past week, because I think that a lot of the counter-arguments were made in good faith, and maybe some of them even brought up some good points. But before we get to that, I just want you to lay out your case. I mean, is this argument about classical music elitism and overpriced tickets or very expensive experiences, is that something that you have heard a lot in your career? And what do you make of that as an argument on the face of it?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is I never meant to start an argument, although that's my that's my naivety about Twitter, of course, because everything ends up being an argument on Twitter, whether you wanted it to or not. The idea of the tweet really was all about perception and what people think they know about classical music and what they think they know about pop music. It was not, absolutely not, a comment on the prices of the tickets. Frankly, if I was a promoter of Adele, that's what I'd be doing. You only sell tickets at a price you know people are going to pay. And of course, the fact that it's sold out proves that point perfectly. It's not really about that. It was about the fact that so often in my life in this industry, people have said to me, to my face, well, of course, classical music's only really for posh people. What they really mean is they feel, for whatever reason, excluded from it because they think it's too expensive. They think that concerts are too expensive, or they only ever see the headlines that come out about the Royal Opera House or any opera house. They only ever talk about opera when it comes to price, which, of course, are more expensive, the tickets, than your regular day-to-day concert. And I sit there and I think, my goodness, actually, when you compare a regular orchestral concert, especially here in the UK, to something like going to see a soccer match or a Formula One race, or indeed a pop concert, it's actually pretty good. And I don't think the price of it excludes anyone particularly. I mean, students, for example, my wife works for the London Symphony Orchestra. She started a scheme called Student Pulse, which is an app which allows students to, they join in, they find out what concerts are going on and whether those concerts will offer them £5 tickets. And they can buy these tickets through the app for £5 and go to a concert, which is usually a world-class orchestra with a world-class soloist and all that stuff. And they can see 2 hours of entertainment for £5. Now, and the proms here, of course, the BBC proms are a very good example also, where you can go and see it. I think it's £6 now in the arena. You stand there. That's the best place to go in the Royal Albert Hall. Everywhere else is a bit dodgy when it comes to acoustics, but it's the best place. And you can see the greatest performers in the world for that. No one is ever going to tell me that that is elitist or in any way difficult for people to come in. No one stops you at the door because of what you're wearing, for example, which is another thing that a lot of people talk about. Oh, I'm wearing jeans. I don't suppose they'll welcome me into the concert. Who doesn't welcome? I mean, I've never dressed up for a concert. I've been going to concerts since I was born, pretty much. I've never dressed up for a concert unless I was standing on the stage, which is slightly different. So there's all these perceptions about classical music that are simply wrong. The trouble is, I think, that our industry is too afraid often to say that they're wrong. And everybody wants to put an enormous amount of effort into trying to get those people who are already thinking the wrong things about our industry into our concerts. And I've not always been that enthusiastic about that. I'm quite old-fashioned when it comes to access to classical music, because I often feel that the audience needs to put the effort in. Why should everybody else put the effort in just to welcome everybody in? Now, of course, at the root of all of this, in this country particularly, is the fact that most of the classical music, if not all, is supported by the state, which means we all pay for it, essentially. This is an argument that a lot of people did make on Twitter as a response to mine, which is, oh, well, Adele doesn't get any money from the state, but classical music does. So it's not comparing like for like. Well, that's a good point, but it wasn't the point I was making. Because again, I wasn't really talking about the price of the tickets. I was talking about the perception of what classical music compared to pop music. It is important to remember that. And of course, internationally, most other people don't know what the hell we're talking about and can't believe it, for example, when you say that almost every orchestral concert has lost money before you've even started. And people say, well, what's the point then? And that's becoming increasingly difficult to answer.
Whether where we ended up is where you meant to end up or not, I think it is worth still having a conversation about why people think this like false impression about elite, because I'm totally on the same page. Like, we're not actually elitist. So why do people think that we are? And how can we fix that?
Well, one of the things that was interesting, I think, out of all of this was the misunderstanding between the word elitist and elite, because everyone always talks about elite sport as a positive thing. Oh, they're elite sportsmen. They're amazing. They're really, really good. They're the top of their profession. But as soon as you say an elite musician, people get all nervous and defensive and say, oh my God, oh no, that might mean we've excluded other people from this. Oh no, they probably came from a rich family, and oh no, somebody wasn't able to do it, but they were, and so on and so forth. It's really bizarre, actually, the difference of opinion between elite sport and elite music. And I think that often does actually get confused with elitism, which is a very, very different thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, my impression of the conversation was that somewhere along the way, there were the people who define elite as high level, and there are the people who define elite or elitism, whatever, as expensive. And we are in a moment right now, worldwide, where we are all kind of coming to deal with, well, if we make people feel like expensive, then that's exclusionary in some structural way, right? That we've somehow purposefully or inadvertently shaped our field in order to be exclusive in some way. And that's where I think all of us are going to be like, well, we kind of recognize that there are some ways in which, okay, so here's where I try to see into the argument of the other side a little bit. The place in which this field does tend to be exclusionary is in the cost of education. So anyone who wishes to take up an instrument, for example, there is a higher cost because this stuff is hard. It's difficult to learn. And I feel like we don't deal well with that concept as a society right now.
No, and I come back to sport again. If you want to be a really good sports person, you have to pay for extra stuff. You have to pay for equipment. You have to pay for clothing. You have to pay for training. Everyone I know, I say everyone, like I know lots and lots of really elite sportsmen. I know a couple, and they are just as dedicated from just as early age as musicians. All musicians always talk, oh, I've spent my lifetime learning this. Well, yeah, of course you have, but so have lots of other people in lots of other professions. It's not unique in that way. And in sport, that's exactly the same. You might have started at 6 and shown some amazing talent, and you were guided through. But if you're going to be really, really good, then you have to go the extra yard. You have to, your parents may well have given up something in order to pay for you to go on a course or have some extra training, all the rest of it, exactly the same way as musicians. I was thinking about this with someone like Lewis Hamilton or Jenson Button, top flight, brilliant Formula One drivers. What everyone always talks about with them, rightly, is that they started in karting, which is kind of the entry point for most racing drivers, right? And they were very small when they did it. But what they talk about is how their parents sacrificed so much to get them through that period. They gave up, they did 3 jobs, they gave up this, they gave up that, they didn't go on holiday just so that they did, because karting is expensive. But they always talk about this as this is amazing.
Right.
How did these people do it? They gave up so much to make sure that their son became such an amazing driver. No one ever talks that way about musicians. What everyone always assumes is that the parents of the musicians were somehow just exercising their privilege. And it's never thought of that musicians' parents might have done 3 jobs or given something up in order for those musicians to go on tour or on courses or on being in youth orchestras, all these things that cost money. This is one of my big points I always try and make when these things come up, is that there is an inverted snobbery towards classical music in that sense. And look, you asked why are people thinking this way? Why have they got the wrong perception? The answer has to be ignorance. They're not being taught it in schools anymore anyway. We all know that. It has to be down to ignorance in the end. They don't know about it. They just think they know about it. It's one of those things. They know more about sport because it's more visible. It's on the television more often. So they know about all that stuff. They don't know about classical music. They push it to the side because they just think it's this one thing and that's it.
So would the part of the solution be to mount a more robust public education thing, more spotlighting on television? Like, what ought we to do other than start Twitter firestorms, which is again what we didn't mean to do? Like, how can we make this conversation a productive one?
I suppose it depends totally on whether you think it's worth doing or not, doesn't it?
Well, let's accept that as an assumption here in this room,
because there are going to be a lot of people who just don't like classical music and they move on, right? There's nothing wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't like country music. I don't need somebody to then come along and teach me it. to enlighten me. I don't really need that anymore. I'm too old to worry about that stuff anyway. We are one of the only industries that feels necessary to educate people about what we do all of the time. We spend so much time saying, oh, but if you listen to this, your life would be just so much better. You know what? People think that's patronizing nonsense, and they're quite right to think that. We're obviously going to be enthusiastic about music. We're going to want people to hear it, but often it's the way we put it doesn't quite, I don't think, manage to put that enthusiasm across. It so often comes across as a little bit patronizing. So, I think everybody should have a better music education, no question about that, because right now, especially with classical music, it seems to have taken a massive dive, certainly in this country. I can't talk with any authority about any other country. America's not had a great education system when it comes to music for a long time. I know that much. But that's not there anymore. We have to accept that. I think we should try much harder to teach people about all kinds of music at school, so that they then inevitably will choose which path they want to go down. Not everybody loves everything. The only important thing I think here is that everybody's given the opportunity. Whether they reject it or not is another thing, but at least they're being given the opportunity. And that was certainly the case when I was younger. And I don't think it's the case now. I think so many people are given what they think they need rather than what they don't know already. And that's why this perception of classical music just continues and continues and continues.
Well, speaking of kind of continuing that perception, I sometimes also feel that there is a little bit of gatekeeping that's going on within our audiences as well, right? Setting up the perception of, oh, you can't really fully, truly enjoy a Mahler symphony unless you've read XYZ and heard, all these other albums and CDs of past performances of this piece. I think that's actually a critical point to make in terms of, I think, what people think of as kind of exclusionary in that sense as well. It's not necessarily just the money or the education, but also just this aura that we've set up for ourselves that somehow we can't fully enjoy something unless we're completely knowledgeable in it.
Well, we're always our own worst enemy in this whole argument, I think. I mentioned the proms earlier. I think the only place I've ever felt excluded, in a sense, not really excluded because I wasn't literally excluded, but where I've thought to myself, oh God, I don't want to be part of this, is at the proms in the arena, where there is a small set of people whose life seems to be devoted to keeping as many people away from them as possible, because they're the real fans. They're the ones that shout hurrah or bravo a millisecond after a piece finishes, particularly one that most people don't know, because then they can show that they know this piece. I remember being Stockhausen's Gruppen, right? Which, when I first started going to see Gruppen, no one was there. It was like 20 people there. Now it's a big event piece. Everybody goes. And the last time I went was at the proms. And the whole point of the piece is space. It's his use of space, but also space between the notes. And the piece just fades away. And of course, as it was fading away, someone shouted bravo and started clapping. And I just thought, this is not the club I want to be a member of. It's horrible. And it was an assault on the music for me. Now, those are the people who I worry about, because you're right. They want to keep it that way. They want to be the ones that say they've got 1,000 proms programs, they've been to everything, and you don't really know as much as them. There's all that. And that's a problem, because also that can be a bit more of the public face of what we do, particularly when it's televised. And you're right. So people are put off by that. But, there are so many other options available that I don't think we should spend too much time trying desperately to drag them in if they don't want to come in. Let's let them arrive when they're ready.
I just do want to say a word on behalf of proms attendees, of the promers. The few times that I've been to the proms, people have been extremely nice to me when I've been down there on the ground hanging out, and people sneak in their little picnics and whatever, and they're very nice and they want to hear about where I'm coming from and who they are. But of course, when you go to the proms, there is this, they have these little cliques, right? And they know their special little traditions and everything, and it's just crazy. And the thing that you mentioned about those people who want to show that they are the cognoscenti, right? And that they know so much. They know when this very recondite piece of music is over. They're not new. They've been around for a long time. And that, I think, has to do with the accrued associations about elitism. And I mean, because what do people know about classical music? Okay, so they think that the tickets are expensive. Well, we've discussed that that's not right. They think that you have to wear a tuxedo. That's also not right. Although I have to say, I wish more people would do that. I believe in dressing up. And frankly, a lot of the people who want to try out the orchestra experience, they're like young people. They have no experience of going to an orchestra concert. They think that it's a very romantic date night. You know, they see like the Valentine's concerts coming up. They're going to do it. They show up. Or especially if they're like members of ethnic minorities. In this country, I've talked to a lot of people who talk about this. They like the dressing up. You know, that's like a big part of their culture, is getting really looking very spiffy and coming out. And then they show up and it's all these schlubby old white dudes who are just wearing their, you know, t-shirts and jeans and everything. So I don't know, there's something to be said about that. And then the other things that people know about, I think, that give this perception of elitism is you have to be quiet the whole time. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's true. It's not like a pop concert. And then there's all of the clapping rules. Now, as somebody who believes firmly in clapping between movements of pieces that were written to have applause between movements, which is pretty much everything up until at least 1880, 1890, probably 1900. I am against that, and I think that we should change that. And if people would just use their ears and their common sense and we let them clap and encourage them to do it, then that would be great.
But you say we should change that. But no one ever said you couldn't do it. It's different.
Yeah,
there's a difference
true.
between saying you can't do it and making people feel uncomfortable when they do. That's two very, very different things. And
That's
I totally
true.
agree with you, because I would clap between movements. I mean, I don't, as it happens, clap between movements, but I don't mind if people do.
But what I feel is that it's so baked into the culture now that I think that people explicitly have to be given permission to do it. And this is something that I do as a conductor. Before, if I'm playing a Beethoven symphony, I will say, look, we have letters from Beethoven in which he said, oh, the second movement was so popular, it was applauded so much, we had to play it again. And so I tell people, you are welcome to applaud. I would be very happy for you to applaud. So I think that it has to be explicitly permitted now. But anyway, these are a number of the things that I think get to this this perception of elitism in classical music. And then to this question of elite versus elitist, you know, the other thing is that, like, Tommy, as you say, classical music is not for everybody. And that is fine. That's okay. Not everybody has to like everything. Not everybody has to like our thing.
No.
But our thing is, in addition to being a minority taste, it is a minority taste that requires deep listening, quiet, concentration. To a certain extent, it requires a desire for, I don't know, some people come to it because they like complexity. Some people come to it because they just like the sheer raw power of it. People come to it for different reasons, but it's always a minority opinion. And you know, you talk about education, and people are not necessarily going to get that first exposure unless they have an education that gives them, or a family background that gives them that first exposure. So, you know, you're already talking about a small percentage of the population. And I'm not saying that people who are not given that kind of education can't also find their way into classical music, because I know many people who come from very disadvantaged backgrounds and have found their life's passion and work in classical music and their true joy. So, I mean, these are just more of the reasons that I think the image exists. The other thing that I wanted to get to was, as you say, a lot of the people who were arguing with you online clearly come to this from a place of ignorance. They don't know what it's really like to go to an orchestra concert or an opera performance or something like that. On the other hand, there were people who are coming to it who are very much not ignorant. I mean, there are a lot of, like, you know, scholars or musicologists or other people who responded with various argumentation points. And in some ways, I think that, yeah, I mean, maybe they're looking at it from this sort of, you know, not just the ticket price perspective, and they're talking about all this accoutrement that surround classical music. But I also think that, like, there's some of these people who, I don't know, it's like they want classical music to be elitist or to have the appearance of elitism because they want to like have something to fight against. I don't know. That was a little bit of a takeaway from some of the responses. And I don't know if you had that same opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, what was interesting was that some people within the industry couldn't really get to grips with the idea that we might not all agree on something. I mean, I think this is happening so often now in all aspects of life, where there is suddenly this opinion that everybody must have. And if one doesn't have it, you're pushed away, particularly on Twitter, of course, quite violently. But in our industry, I think a lot of the time there are accepted views on certain things. And the idea that someone might have a different view on it is just, it does their heads in. I mean, your point about about being quiet in concerts, this is repeated so often, isn't it? Oh, why can't I bring drinks in? Why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? Why can't I look at my mobile phone? Blah, blah, blah. And you think, God, if you really can't sit still and be quiet for an hour, what's wrong with you? Or don't come. Don't come. If you don't want to concentrate, don't come, because what you'll do is you'll stop other people who do want to do that from enjoying it. For the most part of what we're talking about, it's art. It's important. It's interesting. It's engaging. It's supposed to get our brains working. That's what we go for that kind of stimulation. And that also means enjoyment. People often forget that those two things can actually be connected when it comes to classical music. But I think that's at the root of a lot of what my response is on Twitter, was that I don't agree with them. And I think they thought I did really, and that we all just accept that what we want is this. And I'm not sure that's necessarily a healthy thing, that we all just accept it. I think we need to do things like we're doing now and discuss it openly. It's very difficult to discuss stuff like this openly within the industry's environment at the moment.
Well, I think that this has been a wonderful discussion, and one that I hope that our listeners will not only enjoy themselves, but will participate in. Listeners, please, we would love to hear from you about your thoughts about this. And Tommy, the final question that we have for you, would you be willing to stick around and recommend something for our classical mixtape?
I absolutely would.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Tommy, what would you like to share with our listeners?
Well, I thought I would share something that I'm working on at the moment. It's been a very, very difficult 18 months for many people in my position, because we haven't really had any concerts to produce. But now things are starting to move a little bit. And I'm really excited about my latest project, which is a film with the soundtrack played live by an orchestra. And it's the oldest film I've done. I did North by Northwest, the great Hitchcock masterpiece, which is 1959 with Bernard Herrmann's music. I did that. It was wonderful. This one goes back even further to 1948, and it's Scott of the Antarctic, which is a classic British film, and it has a score by Vaughan Williams. And a lot of people will know a lot of the music from that film because he turned it into one of his symphonies, Sinfonia Antarctica. But this is the original score that he wrote, and we're doing it live to picture for the very first time. I'm excited to say that the premiere will be at the Barbican in London with the BBC Symphony Orchestra in March. That's going to be announced very, very soon. And there's quite a lot of other performances that are happening next year because it's Vaughan Williams' 150th anniversary. So there's a lot of Vaughan Williams going on next year. So let's get ahead of the game here. I just wanted to suggest the main title music for Scott of the Antarctic by Vaughan Williams, because I mean, it's just unmistakable Vaughan Williams, beautifully scored, and absolutely to die for chord sequence. And like all great film music, it just sends you immediately into that world that you're going to spend time in for the next hour and 40 minutes or so.
Well, bringing cinema and orchestras together, how terribly elitist of you.
Absolutely.
Kidding aside, thank you very much for your suggestion and also for joining us this week.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, Tiffany, what do you have for us?
Well, this is not apropos of anything, but I was just thinking this week that I love waltzes, and I love waltzes with good melodies, which I think puts me exclusively in the like Russian kind of waltz rather than the like the Viennese waltz, because somehow I find I'm really compelled by like Russian waltz melodies. So here is Prokofiev's Cinderella waltz from his ballet score.
I love the score. It's actually really underrated, I think, in terms of his ballet music. So thank you for bringing that to us. William, what do you have?
All right, folks. Well, I have a concert coming up this Saturday. So people, if you're listening, harmoniaseattle.org, get those tickets available in person and live streaming. Very important for our audience outside of the city of Seattle. We are performing Brahms' Ein deutsches Requiem, the German Requiem. And I've recommended that on the mixtape before. So what I'd like to recommend this time is the piece that we are pairing with it. This is a work called Elegy for Brahms by the British composer Sir Charles Hubert Hastings Parry, the composer of one of the great barn burners of English choral music called I Was Glad. This piece, the Elegy for Brahms, he wrote after hearing about the death of Brahms, which is, 1897. He lived until 1918, never quite put all the finishing touches on this. He died in the last major worldwide pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic. He died of the flu. But this piece is just a fantastic piece of high romanticism, some very Brahmsy moments, but also some Wagnerian and even Straussian moments. It's an amazing piece that never gets played. I mean, we are giving the second United States performance of this, and it was first heard in 1918. So I really encourage people to listen to this. I think it's a very interesting piece.
Great. Thanks, Will and Toy 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 for your concert this weekend. So I'm cheating a little bit because this isn't exactly something that caught my ear this week. It was like maybe a week ago that this caught my ear, but I haven't been able to stop listening to it since. So this is an encore that Augustin Hadelich played at a performance at Bravo Vale Festival. And he's performing here Coleridge-Taylor Perkinson's Louisiana Blues Strut. And I think if I were able to play this piece, which is extremely difficult, I think this would be my encore every single time. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Tiffany Liu, and on behalf of Kensho Watanabe and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.